across indie games industry. Specifically, I will be talking about the impact of live service games and the growing budgets to develop games. So live service games, games that receive constant updates, new content, DLC, microtransactions, battle passes, new characters, new game modes, etc. And a positive of this is that they need developers to work on that new content. So it's a way of keeping people employed. As long as the game has a player base and people coming and spending that money, then they can keep people working on it constantly. Another benefit is that with the money that they can bring in, they can fund smaller games, they can fund indie games. Studios that developed like Among Us and Palworld went into publishing after their games came out and were successful. So that is a benefit of those kinds of games. To give an example of some, Fortnite and League of Legends. Fortnite has brought in 2023, Fortnite brought in 3.5 billion and League of Legends brought in 1.8. Publishers and developers would love that kind of recurrent revenue. That will always look good for the shareholders. To give an example of some of the negative impacts, we can look at Sony and Ubisoft. In 2022, the then CEO at that time, Jim Ryan, announced 12 live service games to release in up to 2025. One of them released, Helldivers 2, that released to some success and has a player base to this day. Their next game, however, Concord, did not. It released low player base and only lasted 2 weeks before it was sunsetted, and then afterwards the studio, Firewalk, was closed down. After that, Sony cancelled a majority of those in development live service games, and as a result some of the studios working on them were forced in layoffs or closures. Bluepoint was a studio Sony purchased that were famous for their remakes like Demon's Souls, The Last Guardian, Shadow of the Colossus, and they were working on a God of War live service before that closed down along the studio. The problem with live service games is the amount of time people have in the day, and if every game needs your constant attention, people can only play so many. I suppose a positive of that is once you have your sort of game that you're attached to and you put in time and money into, that's a good way of having a consistent player base and recurrent revenue. But in addition to that, Sony spent 3.5 billion to purchase Bungie, the developers of Halo and Destiny. They did this for two reasons: to retain their employees and for their expertise on live service games. They were consultants on the Last of Us multiplayer game before that was cancelled, and since purchasing them, Bungie have laid off 17% of their staff. They've suffered numerous controversies to do with plagiarism, and Destiny 2 has reached its lowest player count in its history. Along with that, their other released game, Marathon, came out to success, but with its reported budget of about 250 million, I believe, it hasn't reached the success that Sony want from it. With the focus on live service games, they've put a lot of resources in and gotten very little in return. And speaking of that, Ubisoft have had to go through significant restructuring, closing multiple studios, their Halifax and Leamington studios, as well as voluntary redundancies at their Paris headquarters. They've had to close several in-development projects, their Prince of Persia remake, as well as some others. And they've had to lay off people at Massive Entertainment, as well as Red Storm. There's a lot of reasons for this. Ubisoft have a reputation as trend chasers. They released a Call of Duty style live service game called X Defiant. That released in 2024 and it closed in 2025. They released a Battle Royale, Hyperscape, in 2020, only to close that 2 years later. They released several NFT based games, and even at the height of their popularity, NFT games weren't popular. So the player base just wasn't there for those either. And tying it into the other topic of budgets, Ubisoft have 2 games. To give an example, of Skull and Bones was a pirate game they released, announced in 2017 and released in 2024. Beyond Good and Evil 2 has been in development for 17 years with a reported budget of 500 million. Games are becoming more and more expensive to produce and create, and several world events can have knock-on effects on that. The war in Iran is making energy more expensive. That is causing studios to have higher prices running all of the PCs and machines to develop their games. So when a studio or a publisher needs to show growth to the shareholders for their quarterly reports, a good way of doing that is layoffs. Quickly helps show more money in the balance. So layoffs can be affected by numerous things. With Sony, they've spent many years of the PS5 life cycle developing these live service games, and by closing them they've essentially wasted a good chunk of time that could be spent bringing out games that people are interested in on cancelled projects. A problem with trend chasing is that, Jason Schreier's book Blood, Sweat and Pixels, I noticed a significant problem with some developers is funding. When Microsoft cancelled their game Stormlands that they were working in collaboration with, they had to fire a good chunk of their staff, including people that had been hired the week before. When another studio, Double Fine, released a Kickstarter to fund their game that reached massive success, Obsidian did the same. They released a Kickstarter for a game that Pillars of Eternity that wasn't popular at the time, a CRPG. By marketing themselves directly to their player base, they were able to find massive success as well, and have released Pillars of Eternity and now Pillars of Eternity 2 through crowdfunding. While layoffs are obviously not good, they can have some positive knock-on effects. More and more people are turning to indie or AA games, smaller budgets but still with good resources and attention. People are making more experimental and personal games. Solo developers. Balatro was developed by one or two people, and that was a Game of the Year contender. So there are some knock-on positive effects. In the games industry, there are always sort of growth and stagnation periods. A big contributor to these layoffs is during the 2020 sort of COVID pandemic, people were at home and they were gaming more. It was one of the only hobbies that you could do to interact with people that you could do from your house. So that led to the industry making a lot more money and having a lot more players than they normally would. During this time they overhired. They didn't really see that this wouldn't last, and ever since they've had to lay off a good chunk of the people that they hired during the pandemic. Sort of a short-sighted. So in conclusion, the current period of layoffs is a response to the pandemic overhiring, as well as games being more boom or bust, hit or miss. If a game comes out and succeeds, good. If it doesn't, then that can often lead to the death of the studio. People laid off. To give one more example, Wildlight was a studio that released High Guard. That game was a multiplayer live service, and it didn't last a year. It was shut down, I believe, a month or so maybe 2 months after it came out. So again, that shows like the risks of these kinds of games. I believe the industry will become more stable over time. More and more people are getting into the industry, and with the rise of successful indie and AA games, people are finding a balance with their budgets and their management of resources that can lead to more job stability and security, where a failure won't lead to the immediate death of the studio. Thank you very much for listening. I will link any relevant sources or information I used for this in my report.